Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system. The customary quote: "It is during our darkest moments that we must focus to see the light." From the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who lived during a time of ancient Greece. A brief review of the last part where we started and completed the 5th chapter on exchanging. After discussing concepts of exchanging to open a file, exchanging to destroy a defender, exchanging to avoid loss of time, selling one's life as dearly as possible, and when and how exchanges usually take place, with illustrations given by Nimzowitsch, and then also went through a couple of endgame illustrations towards the end of the chapter. So now, moving further into the book, we begin chapter 6, the elements of endgame strategy. Nimzowitsch begins the chapter with some general introductory remarks and writes: "It is a well-known phenomenon that the same amateur who can conduct the middle game quite creditably is usually perfectly helpless in the end game. One of the principal requisites of good chess is the ability to treat both middle and end game equally well. True, it lies in the nature of things that the student should gather their first experience in the opening and middle game. But this evil, for such it is, must be rectified as early as possible. It should be pointed out to the beginner at the very start that the endgame does not merely serve up tasteless fragments left over from the rich feast of the middle game. The endgame is, on the contrary, that part of the game in which the advantages created in the middle game should be systematically realized. Now, this realization of advantages, particularly those of an immaterial kind, is by no means a subordinate or less important business. Very much the reverse. All the player's qualities as man, woman, and as artist are demanded of it. In order to know and to be able to appreciate what is happening in the end game, one must be acquainted with the elements out of which it is compounded, for the end game has its elements just as much as has the middle game. One of these elements, the passed pawn, we have already analyzed thoroughly. There remains to be considered, number 1, centralization, with a subsection on the management of the king, that is, the shelter and bridge building. Number 2, the aggressive rook position and the active officer in general. Number 3, the rallying of all isolated detachments. Number 4, the combined advance. And finally, number 5, an element already touched upon, the materialization of files, to be understood in the sense that the file which at first exercised an abstract influence is narrowed down to a concrete point, protected by a pawn, or gains a concrete aspect. The endgame would in fact be in itself most interesting, even had Rink and Troitsky never lived." Now I am assuming that Nimzowitsch is here referring to Christian Heinrich Rink, a German music composer and organist around the early 19th century, and Alexei Troitsky, a Russian chess composer who lived around the early 20th century and is considered as one of the greatest composers of chess endgame studies. Moving further, Nimzowitsch discusses regarding number 1, centralization, with the following points: A of the king, B of the minor pieces, C of the queen, the journey to the king's castle. Nimzowitsch writes: Point A, the great mobility of the king forms one of the chief characteristics of all endgame strategy. In the middle game, the king is a mere super or extra, In the endgame, on the other hand, one of the principles. We must therefore develop him, bring him nearer to the fighting line. This is brought about by centralizing the king. Accordingly, the rule runs: when the endgame is entered, let the king set himself in motion and strive to reach the center of the board. For from this point he can, according to need, make for the right or left, that is, attack the enemy king or queen's wing. For example, consider the skeleton position on board. Only the most important actors are indicated. King f2 pushing towards the center and at the same time protecting his base, the points e1 and e2, against the entry of the enemy rook by rook e1 or rook e2. Second example, consider the position on board. Here too, the first moves are king f2 to e2, and in this position white chooses the queen side and plays king d1 to c2, thus protecting the b pawn and releasing the rook, which can now undertake something, say by rook d7. The third example is from a game between Akiba Rubinstein versus Aron Nimzowitsch, played in the Carlsbad tournament of 1907 in Carlsbad or Karlovy Vary, located in present-day Czech Republic. Nimzowitsch writes, third example, in the position on board, white played knight c3. Since the immediate centralization of the king would have miscarried because of bishop d5. For instance, king f1, bishop c4 check, king e1, bishop d5, and forces the exchange of pieces or win of a pawn. As such, knight c3 was played by white. After bishop c4, f4, king e7, king f2, king d6, king e3, and king c5. The proper moment for white to get in touch with the point d4 was passed. If the kings had been at d4 and d6 respectively, the win would have been much harder for black. The game, however, now plays itself g4 and king b4. This is the point. The central position c5 is to be regarded as a stepping stone to an attack on the wing, and therein lies the significance of centralization. King d4 too late, bishop b3, g5, a4, knight b1, bishop e6, g3, king b3, knight c3, a3, king d3, g6, king d4, king c2, and white resigns. In this example, we have been able to look at this advance to the center from another side, and we have seen that it is meant not only to give our own king freedom to move about, but also to restrict the terrain accessible to the enemy king. For this reason, the king often fights for a point as if a kingdom depended on it. The student should bear this carefully in mind, that he must leave no means untried to bring his king as near the center as possible, partly for his own king's sake, but partly also in order to limit the scope of the enemy king, who must not be allowed a place in the sun. Point B. Centralization must not be regarded as a purely royal prerogative or right. The other pieces also develop a similar tendency. Take the position on board. Here white has two choices: king d2 to c3 to d4, and knight d4 followed by e3. As in the previous example, the centralization of the knight has here a double effect. The knight keeps from d4 an eye on both wings. Number 2. The knight circumscribes or limits the liberty of the enemy king. Bars, for instance, his journey via e6 to d5. If the enemy rook be still on board, the knight will provide a rampart or defensive wall for their own king, who will take up a central position behind the knight. Dr. Tatakover, the witty author of Die Hypermodern Schachpartei, I hope I pronounced that correctly, I believe it's German, would call this an island of pieces, and a very simple example is one which would result from the position on board, namely by knight d4, followed by king d3 with a central island, king, knight, and pawn. Point C. There is no more impressive proof of the importance of centralization than the fact that even the queen, who in truth exerts sufficient influence even if posted on the edge of the board, herself seeks to attain to a central position. The ideal one would be a centrally placed queen defended by a pawn, and in her turn other pawns. Under such a protectorate, her king can undertake long journeys into enemy country. So for example, the king at f3 in the position on board will try to get to b6 or g6. After many and long wanderings, he arrives at length on one of these squares, reaches safety, and wins. Moving further, Nimzowitsch discusses regarding king's safety in the endgame with a heading, How His Majesty Manages to Protect Himself Against Storms. The shelter, bridge building. Nimzowitsch writes, in order to have protection from the various dangers which may threaten, let the king provide himself in good time with a serviceable shelter. Such a refuge will stand him in good stead should a storm come up. Consider the position on board. Here a7 would be an obvious mistake, for after rook a2 and king b6 to free the rook, the white king would have no protection against the storm. Here the series of checks by the rook to which he is exposed. The right course would be to consider the point a7 as a shelter for the king. Thus, king b6, rook b1 check, king a7, rook b2, rook b8, rook a2, rook b6, rook a1, and king b7. The sun is shining again now, so the old king can venture out. Rook h1, a7, and white wins. Events would take a similar course in the position on board. Here the point d6 would be the shelter, so this must not be made impracticable by d6. The right move is king e6, and if rook e2 check, then king d6, and black has exhausted their checks and are themselves in danger. since their king will be forced away from the queening square. Endgame technique demands of us, in addition, that we should be able to ourselves to build our own shelter, somewhat as the pathfinder builds their tent. In this, bridge building is useful. In the position on board, if white plays king f7, there will follow a series of checks, and in the end the white king will have to return whence he came, his purpose unaccomplished. The key move is rook e4, one which at first sight is somewhat incomprehensible. There follows rook g1, and now the king may venture forth into the light of the day again. King f7, rook f1 check, king g6, rook g1 check, king f6, rook f1 check, king g5, rook g1 check, and rook g4. The bridge is built. The point g5 has become a perfect shelter. After king f6, black could also have marked time, rook g2 instead of rook f1 check. Then there follows a delicious operation which every bridge builder must envy. We transport in fact the whole bridge with all that pertains to it from one place to another and move rook e5 and set up the bridge by means of rook g5, so that our shelter will now be g6. This charming device belongs to the commonest of everyday maneuvers, a proof of the wonderful beauty of chess. It will be interesting to see whether rook e5 at once might not serve. This, as a matter of fact, is the case. Rook e5 also wins, although indeed less convincingly than the author's solution rook e4. After rook e5, there would follow king d6, king f7, rook f1 check, king e8, and not king g6 because of king takes on e5, g8 queen, rook g1 check, and so on. So king e8, rook g1, rook e7, rook a1, rook d7 check, and white wins. Or rook g2 instead of rook a1, king f8, rook g1, rook f7, and so on. Bridge building for the provision of a shelter for the royal traveler is a typical constituent in endgame strategy and is very closely connected with the maneuver which will be treated in number 3, the rallying of all isolated detachments. For another example of bridge building, see game number 10, where on move number 38, knight f5 creates a shelter for the white king at f3. We shall go through this game towards the end of the video series along with other remaining games from the illustrative games section of the book. Once the series is complete, you can fast forward towards the last few videos to look up that game. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system here, and we shall continue onwards from the next one. Shout out to fellow streamer and YouTuber Fortuna Chess Coach for gifting 5 subs to viewers on my Twitch stream 3 weeks ago. Fellow streamer IndoQueen1750 for gifting a sub. IndoQueen has a very fun personality and recently started playing and streaming chess. Do check her stream out. I will post a link to it in the video description. Distant187 aka Sith for gifting a sub. RockyMtnChess, and fellow streamer and YouTuber Mantrala for continuing their subs. IndoQueen, the top chairer with 300 bits. Fellow streamer and YouTuber Faraway at second with 200 bits. And Sacrificial Ninja at third with 5 bits 3 weeks ago. Ollie Pals for gifting a sub and continuing his sub 2 weeks ago. Ollie is an occasional streamer and a good chess player from Iceland, so do check out his stream. I will post a link to it in the video description. Distant187 aka Sith with a gifted sub. LadyTyra and UncleVinny for continuing their subs. emptywavefunction, the top chairer with 2001 bits. Fpawn at second with 600 bits. RockyMtnChess at third with 300 bits. Offbeatopener at fourth with 250 bits. Lord Blizza at fifth with 215 bits. Sacrificial Ninja at 6th with 6 bits, and Goke09 at 7th with 2 bits 2 weeks ago. Thanks a lot for the kind support, everyone. Much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care and stay safe.